A moment in football where admiration turns into judgment, where respect is earned or quietly taken away, and for Neville Southall, that line was never blurred. Because this wasn't a man who threw around hatred lightly. He wasn't built for petty rivalries or dramatic feuds that filled headlines. Instead, his silence was often louder than words, and when he finally spoke, it carried the weight of years spent watching the game change around him. People expected a list of enemies, a roll call of names he couldn't stand, but what they got instead was something far more unsettling, because Southall didn't just dislike players. He judged what they represented, the attitudes, the decisions, the quiet shifts that were reshaping football itself. And when he did draw that line, it wasn't random, it was precise, aimed at the few who, in his eyes, had broken something fundamental. This is not a story about who he hated, it's about why so few ever earned that place in the first place. Welcome to Legend Play. Let's begin. If there was one thing Neville Southall never hid, it was his disdain for certain characters in the game, not out of bitterness, but out of principle forged in the harsh realities of football. He never built his reputation on politeness or diplomacy. Instead, he spoke with the same blunt honesty that defined his performances between the posts. In his autobiography and interviews, the frustration seeps through, not directed at a single enemy, but at a pattern of behavior he believed was poisoning the sport. For Southall, it wasn't about personal hatred, it was about respect, something he felt too many had abandoned in pursuit of fame and fortune. He had little patience for players who crumbled under pressure, those who chased headlines instead of results, or who treated football like a stage rather than a battleground. Inside his world, commitment was everything, and anything less than total dedication was not just disappointing, it was unacceptable. And so, rather than naming one man, Southall drew a line in the sand, making it clear that the type of player he disliked said far more than any single name ever could. And if this story hit you with the same intensity it carried through every word, then you already know this is only the beginning, because legends, like Neville Southall, don't just belong to history books, they belong in conversations like this, where the truth behind football's greatest personalities finally comes alive. If you want more stories that go beyond the surface, where football isn't just highlights but raw emotion, conflict and legacy, then stay locked in. Subscribe now, because what comes next will dig even deeper into the untold sides of the game, the moments, the rivalries and the truths most people never hear. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Yet, even a man as grounded and fair-minded as Neville Southall had his breaking points, and when he spoke about them, the tone shifted from calm reflection to something far more cutting and personal. In the Binman Chronicles, he didn't throw around reckless accusations or sensational claims, but the weight of his words carried years of bottled frustration. He made it clear that while football had introduced him to countless characters, good and bad, there were only a rare few who truly lost his respect completely. One of those figures was Mike Walker, whose spell at Everton FC represented a period that clashed sharply with everything Southall believed the club should stand for. It wasn't just about poor results or tactical disagreements, it was about a sense that standards had slipped, that the identity of the team had been diluted in a way he could not accept. For Southall, Everton was more than a club. It was built on pride, resilience and unity, and anything that threatened that foundation felt like a personal betrayal. So when he spoke of Walker, it wasn't loud anger, it was something more lasting, a quiet dismissal that revealed just how deeply that period had affected him. You might have watched some videos on YouTube with a title like Neville Southall names 7 players he hates the most, or 8 players he will never forgive. That's mostly the clickbait. Far from reality, But I'm here to tell you the absolute truth, and here it is. The tension didn't end at club level because his frustration also reached into the international stage, where his relationship with the Football Association of Wales became another source of lingering disappointment. Representing Wales had always meant something profound to Southall. It was about identity, loyalty, and playing for something far bigger than himself. Yet over time, he felt that the very institution meant to protect and elevate Welsh football often fell short of its responsibilities. There were moments where players felt unsupported, where decisions seemed disconnected from the realities on the pitch, and where commitment from the top didn't match the sacrifices made by those wearing the shirt. For a player who gave everything, every time he stepped onto the field, that disconnect was impossible to ignore and even harder to forgive. It wasn't about one incident, but a pattern that slowly eroded trust, turning pride into frustration and admiration into criticism. And so, while Southall rarely spoke of hatred in personal terms, these experiences stood as exceptions, not because of emotion alone, but because they challenged everything he believed football should be, even when respect remained. It didn't guarantee peace, and the uneasy dynamic between Neville Southall and Joe Royle became one of those quiet, lingering stories that never exploded, but never disappeared either. Southall never painted Royle as a villain. In fact, he openly admitted that he generally liked him, which made the situation all the more complex and difficult to process. But football is rarely just about personalities. It's about decisions, and Royle's choice to freeze Southall out at Everton FC created a fracture that respect alone couldn't repair. For a player who had defined an era at the club, who had carried its hopes through countless battles, being pushed aside felt less like a tactical shift and more like a quiet ending he hadn't agreed to. There was no dramatic fallout, no shouting matches or headlines, just a slow, uncomfortable distance that grew between two men who once shared the same purpose. It was the kind of tension that didn't need words, because both understood exactly what had happened, even if neither chose to fully confront it. And in those moments, away from the pitch, the reality of it all settled in, not as anger, but as something heavier, a sense of unfinished business that refused to fade. He believed that football, at its core, was about adaptation, about walking into unfamiliar territory and finding a way to survive, then dominate. The great players, regardless of where they came from, didn't complain. They adjusted, they learned, and they earned the respect of teammates and fans alike. But those who arrived with excuses created a divide, not just in the dressing room, but in the spirit of the game itself. Southall saw it as a mentality issue, a shift from hunger to comfort, from proving yourself to protecting yourself. And that shift didn't sit well with someone who had built his entire career on resilience and accountability. He didn't need to name individuals, because for him, the behavior itself was enough to draw the line. In the end, it wasn't about where a player came from. It was about how they carried themselves once they stepped onto English soil, and whether they respected the fight that came with it. As the game evolved, Neville Southall found himself increasingly at odds with what football was becoming, not because he rejected change, but because he questioned what was being lost along the way. He spoke with clear frustration about the rise of a new kind of footballer, one he felt was drifting away from the raw essence of the sport. In his eyes, too many players began prioritizing money, fame, and social media presence over the craft itself, turning football into something closer to a performance than a battle. It wasn't that success or recognition bothered him. He had earned both, but he believed they should come as a result of dedication, not replace it. For someone who built his career on resilience and sacrifice, the idea of shortcuts, distractions, or misplaced priorities felt like a betrayal of everything the game stood for. Yet even in his criticism, there was balance, because Southall wasn't blindly dismissive of the modern generation. He often stood up for younger players, especially those misunderstood by the media, showing that his issue was never with youth, but with mindset. And that distinction becomes even clearer when you look at the players who truly tested him, the ones who pushed him to his limits on the pitch. Facing names like Ian Rush, Kenny Dalglish, and Mark Hughes wasn't just difficult, it was relentless, the kind of challenge that left lasting memories. He admitted they gave him nightmares, not out of fear, but because of the sheer quality and intelligence they brought into every encounter. These were players who demanded perfection from him, who exposed even the smallest mistake and forced him to elevate his game every single time. But unlike the types he criticized, these men earned his respect completely because they embodied professionalism in its purest form. They didn't complain, they didn't chase distractions, they simply performed at the highest level again and again. And in that contrast lies Southall's true philosophy, not about eras or generations, but about what it truly means to respect the game. If you made it this far, then hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one.